I gave my little brother something he couldn't refuse that would turn things around when our parents left us alone. My name is Aaron, and I never thought that I would be thrust into the most thrilling days of our lives. Growing up, I would encounter circumstances similar to this with my younger brother James, and he was 5 years younger than me, yet we had an unbreakable kinship. He was always the child I assisted with his studies and watched out for the person I shielded from bullying. But as we grew older, life started to drag us down. James was still negotiating high school, while I proceeded in various directions, attending college and eventually entering the workforce. Our parents' hectic work schedules left little time for family time, while he was at school and figuring out who he was. Bonding. They weren't careless, they were simply away, which meant that a large portion of James's care was their responsibility. Fell on me, particularly after I was old enough to drive and manage household duties. It wasn't a hardship, though. Being around James never felt like work because he was laid back, always willing to please and quick to grin. However, problems changed after I left home at the age of 24 and moved into a little apartment on the opposite side of town. I stopped going home as frequently as I ought to have, and every time I considered how much I missed from James's life, the carefree guilt tore at me. It hurt more than I wanted to realize that the child I remembered was becoming someone I hardly knew. Admittedly, my parents told James that they would be leaving town for a business retreat one weekend, leaving him alone for... My mother contacted me 3 days ago, her voice tinged with concern, and she asked if I could stay. She claimed she was old enough to take care of herself with him, but it would give me knowing you're there gives me peace of mind. I agreed more out of guilt than anything else. I didn't have any major plans for the weekend, and when I got to the house, perhaps spending time with James would be an opportunity to catch up. Long time not seen. James's typical lopsided smile greeted me at the entrance. He taunted me, grabbing me in a short embrace. "Yeah," I replied, rolling my eyes but grinning. "You missed me?" He chuckled and moved aside to allow me to enter. The house appeared to be as clean as ever, but there was a slight odor of lemon cleanser in the air. It feels odd to return, like if I've entered a time capsule from my adolescence. James and I spent the first evening catching up, and he told me about his goals for college, school, and friends. It was nice to share tidbits of my personal life in order to close the gap that had developed throughout the years between us. And for a while, it seemed as though nothing had changed. However, as the hours went by, I began to observe aspects of James that I had not before noticed. He was no longer a child. He was taller now, with wider shoulders and a deeper voice. He exuded a calm assurance and maturity that, when I last paid close attention, I hadn't been there. So it took me by surprise, and I was having trouble reconcile the young man seated across from me with the picture of the younger brother I'd always known. James and I tidied up the kitchen and finished dinner that evening. As he scrolled through the TV's possibilities, he advised watching a nice movie. But it wasn't one of those, "Pardon me," I murmured, acting as though I was offended by your taste in dull movies. He grinned and finally decided on a comedy that we had both seen a dozen times, saying the film was flawless. He collapsed onto the couch next to me as the opening credits rolled, spreading his long legs wide and settled in for a... However, it was simple to put everything else aside and savor the moment when we both laughed at the same jokes. Chanted words we knew by memory, settling into a rhythm that seemed comfortable and safe. but occasionally I would catch James staring at me in a manner that seemed odd or unnerving, but it was so intense that it made my stomach turn. Told myself there was nothing there and that I was just dreaming that he was my brother. There was something odd about the way James stared at me at the end of the film. He stood up and went to the kitchen after stretching and yawning. "I'm going to grab a drink," he murmured. Waited for him to return, staying on the couch and browsing through my phone, but a few minutes later, I heard his Aaron. I called back because I heard a voice from the kitchen saying, "You want something?" He surprised me by returning with 2 soda cups, which he handed to me. One to me, then he sat down again. This time, his knee touched mine, and I felt a shock of trying not to speak. I said, "Thank you," for something I couldn't quite describe. Steady, he shrugged and took a sip of his beverage without any issues. Told myself there was nothing there, and that I was just dreaming that he was my brother. There was something odd about the way James stared at me at the end of the film. He stood up and went to the kitchen after stretching and yawning. "I'm going to grab a drink," he murmured. Waited for him to return, staying on the couch and browsing through my phone, but a few minutes later, I heard his Aaron. I called back because I heard a voice from the kitchen saying, "You want something?" He surprised me by returning with 2 soda cups, which he handed to me. One to me, then he sat down again. This time, his knee touched mine, and I felt a shock of trying not to speak. I said, "Thank you," for something I couldn't quite describe. Steady, he shrugged and took a sip of his beverage without any issues. For a while, we sat quietly while the TV's soft hum filled the room. I tried to concentrate on my phone, but I could sense his warmth at my side. It was quite distracting. Wasn't ready for, so I found myself shifting uneasily, not knowing what to. We sat in quiet for a long time because of the odd energy in the room. Hurriedly dressed and went downstairs after hearing James humming music in the kitchen. He was making breakfast while listening to a song on the radio. He was dressed simply in sweatpants and a t-shirt, with his hair slightly up. He resembled the child I used to tease and look after so much, despite being unkempt from sleep. However, he didn't at the same time, because he was older and more confident. Surprised me this morning when he stated, looking up as I entered, "I made eggs." I said, "Sit down at the table, thank you," and he placed a dish in front of me, and took a seat across from me. His effortless smile made it difficult for me to forget him for a time, and we enjoyed a friendly meal. Turn off the sun's warmth as it shines through the windows. Illuminating, the James added, "This is a nice room," abruptly interrupting the quiet, "to have you here." Yes, as I mentioned, with a smile, it does feel like the past, but I couldn't get rid of the notion that things weren't the same, even as I said it. Something I couldn't quite identify had taken the place of the cozy familiarity of our connection. Something that caused my chest to constrict and my mind to race. Despite my best efforts, I knew it wasn't going away, so I tried to ignore it. The morning passed in a few days of routine, but James and I's underlying conflict persisted. He cleaned the kitchen while I busied myself with little chores, and he was more at ease than I was humming along to the radio. Must prevent overthinking because it seemed like every phrase and every look had significance. By the time lunchtime arrived, I was restless, and James recommended that I didn't feel like sitting still, so I thought we should take a walk instead of watching another movie, said Ed in the hopes that the fresh air would help me decompress. James smiled and said, That sounds good. After I had my shoes on, we went into the neighborhood, where the peaceful streets were lined with— it was a place with big trees and well-kept lawns that felt the same no matter how much time passed. We strolled alongside one another, discussing nothing specific to his classes. My job with the neighbor's dog, who barked at anything that moved, felt effortless once more, as if we had fallen into a rhythm. Had not seen him in years, yet even as we joked and laughed, I couldn't help but notice how his shoulder occasionally touched mine. I told myself it didn't matter if his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking, or if they were against mine. We arrived in the park at the end of the day, but I knew deep down that it wasn't just my imagination running wild. A rush of childhood is brought back by the street's familiar swings and faded basketball court. Recollections James, sitting on a swing with his long legs almost reaching the floor. He motioned for me to join him. After a brief moment of hesitation, I sat on the swing beside him. The chains. It hasn't altered at all, he said, creaking softly as I leaned back. Stated in a nostalgic tone. Yeah, I said, smiling a little. We definitely spent half of our youth here, he remarked. Because it feels that way. Laughing, despite my assurances that I could handle it, you insisted on pushing me on the swings. I smiled as I shot back, since you always leaped off and fell in the mud. He grinned as he looked toward the horizon, where you were constantly— Mom made me promise to keep you out of trouble. Naturally watching out for me, I said softly, You're my little brother. Didn't answer immediately, his face becoming contemplative. Do you ever wonder contemplating how things would be different if Dad was around more? I was taken aback by his inquiry and gave him a confused look. I suppose I finally said, how to respond. But you've done a very good job, you know. You don't need his approval to be proud of yourself. His gaze briefly locked with me. My chest ached from the vulnerability in his eyes. Thank you, he replied softly. That indicates for a while. We sat quietly while listening to the park's birds chirping. It was a quiet time with leaves fluttering in the breeze, yet the tension from earlier was still there. Remained just below the surface before James rose, wiping his— He put his hands against his jeans and remarked, It's getting chilly, so we should go back. Yes, I answered, following his example. The calm between us felt longer as we walked home. Heavier now, I couldn't get rid of the impression that we were dancing about a problem that neither of us could solve. I was prepared to withdraw to the guest room's protection and get some rest by the time we returned home, but James smiled and replied, Let's play a game. I have other plans. I remarked, Thank you for the console controller, as he reached for it. Do the dishes tonight, loser. We settled into a relaxed competitive rhythm for the next hour. James won the most of the rounds as a result of the joking and laughter that helped to ease the stress. He always did, but to his dismay, I was able to secure a couple of victories when we were done. It seemed as though the weird energy from before had subsided, at least temporarily. I'm still. As we shut off the console, I muttered, I'm not doing the dishes, and I crossed my arms in jest. He laughed and added, I'll let you off the hook this time. Defiance was fair enough. The remainder of the evening went by in silence, as we had dinner, discussed our plans for the following day, and finally settled into our daily schedules. But as the evening dragged on and the house became quieter, the tension started to return, and I couldn't get rid of the sense that we were becoming closer, something unsaid but unavoidable. However, later that evening, as I laid in, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling When I heard the gentle, my heart leaped as I heard the floorboards outside my chamber, and I froze while listening, carefully as the footsteps approached, and suddenly Aaron James's voice could be heard. Felt apprehensive, I sat up, and my heart was pounding. "Yes, may I come in?" he asked. Paused, looking at the clock. It was late, and the only sound in the home was the refrigerator's slight hum. "What's up downstairs?" I questioned. "I just need to talk to you," he added in a voice. I exhaled, hardly audible, and swung my legs over the side of the bed. "All right, come in." James entered with an inscrutable expression as the door cracked open. Leaning against the door for a second, he closed it behind him before moving across the room to sit on the side of the bed. Despite the discomfort twisting in my voice, I inquired, "What's going on?" in a steady tone. "Stomach." He didn't respond immediately, instead keeping his eyes on the ground. I've been thinking a lot lately," and he finally mentioned how much you mean to me. His remarks caused my heart to accelerate, and I found it difficult to maintain a neutral attitude. I mentioned carefully that you are my brother James, and we are very important to one another. His voice was shaking as he said, "But that's just the way families operate. In a small way, you've always supported me in a manner that no one else has." "James," I started, but he interrupted me. "I don't want to rapidly destroy what he said, but I don't know what I would do if I didn't want you to know how much you mean to me." His comments carried a weight of meaning that I couldn't quite comprehend without you. Process I gazed at him, my mind whirling as the implicit conflict between when we eventually reached a climax. James's remarks weighed heavy on us. I opened my lips to say something, but the stillness lasted much longer than it should have. Nothing came out of him, but his eyes remained on me, vulnerable. And looking, and I could see the barriers I had painstakingly erected over the years starting to crumble. "James," I said at last, "you have no idea how difficult it is for me to hear my stern yet gentle voice." He shook his head, his brows furrowing. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you," he muttered. I simply had to say it, to get it out, so I took a deep breath and ran a hand through my "You mean a lot to me too," I responded, trying to collect my thoughts. "James, we're siblings, and we've always looked out for one another. That's what family does, but it goes beyond that." He spoke in a shaky voice, and I shook my head. Even though the words were hollow, I said, "You're just confused," as my chest tightened. "We've both been through a lot, especially with Mum and Dad, gone so long, so it's normal to feel closer as I talk to them." He spoke more steadily as a result, so it's not confusion. Rather, it's how I can't act like it doesn't exist, even though I know it's abnormal. I got out of bed, and paced the tiny room, trying to make sense of everything. My mind was a confused muddle, between the want to console him and the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong. I turned to face James and said, "Wrong. We can't continue talking like this. It's not fair enough to none of us." His face wavered, a glimmer of pain crossing his face. "I only needed you to know the truth," he continued, "and I'm not asking for anything." His candor left me stunned, and I returned to my seat on the bed. With my shoulders hunched over and the situation weighing heavily on me, I said in a low voice, "You don't know what to say." I simply could not keep it to myself any longer, so I had to say everything he said. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, and I wanted to make things better. Everything returned to its previous state, but I wasn't sure how we should find a method to get past this. I replied. At last, you're my brother James. He nodded slowly, but his demeanor stayed the same, never changing. Conflicted, he claimed that you are the only one who truly understands, and I don't want to lose you. I firmly stated, you won't lose me, but we must establish limits. The ensuing silence felt oppressive, but this isn't something we can linger on. But James had to get up, and he did so slowly and deliberately. I apologize. I didn't want to offend you when he said that. His voice hardly audible. I'm not angry with you. And I realized that I spoke in a gentle tone, but James nodded again and lingered at the entrance, warning us to be cautious for our own sakes. The gentle click of the door closing behind him felt like a relief for a brief minute before he eventually stepped outside, but my chest continued to tighten. So I sat there for a while, gazing at the empty room and attempting to understand what had just transpired. I'm not sure how, but The following morning was calm, and I could sense that something was going to happen between us. There was a noticeable change in the attitude in the house. James declined to join me for breakfast, and I urged him not to press him. He required space as much as I did, and I believed that all would be resolved in due course. But as the day went on, the stillness grew more difficult to handle between us, so by the afternoon, I made the decision to try breaking. The ice was in his room, sitting on the side of his bed, wearing headphones. When I knocked, he looked up and pulled. Taking off the headphones and smiling hesitantly, I responded, "Hey, stepping inside, how are you?" He shrugged and dropped his eyes to the floor, saying, "I'm fine." I sat. "You holding up?" I realize that things are strange, but I'm down next to him, giving us enough room to feel comfortable. I said at the moment, "But I want us to work this out, because I don't want there to be, I don't know how to fix the tension between us," he remarked gently. I smiled reassuringly and replied, "We'll figure it out. It will take some time. However, we'll get there." He looked at me, his face softening, and thanked me for not, "I'm your brother." So I just said, "I'll always have your back." And the tension subsided. I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in what seemed like days. We continued our conversation, shifting it to more light-hearted subjects like school buddies and the next weekend. The burden on my chest had somewhat decreased by the time I left his room. However, as the house fell silent once more that evening, I couldn't get rid of the impression that James's words, his feelings, and the unquestionable intensity of the previous 3 days lingered in my mind, making me agitated and unsure. And despite my best efforts to persuade myself differently, I knew this was far from that night. The house was quiet, but my thoughts were racing, so I stayed up. My mind was racing as I stared at the ceiling, replaying James's previous remarks and his vulnerability, his candor, and the weight of what he had said. I convinced myself that everything would return to normal and that this was only a bump in the road, but I wasn't certain in my heart. And then at around midnight, I heard faint footsteps on my chest in the corridor. Intensified, and as they approached, they stopped right outside my door. I sat up, clutching my breath while I waited. And then, like the darkness, there was a soft, timid knock. I forced myself to exhale slowly before Aaron James's voice could hardly be heard. To remain composed, "Yes. May I enter?" My heart was pounding as I hesitated, looking at the house was silent and dark, and it was late. Yet I couldn't force myself to send him away once more. There was a brief pause before I said, "Okay?" And then I whispered, "Come in." When the door creaked open and James entered, His hands appeared uneasy, with his shoulders slightly bent and his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. He shut the door behind him, while resting against it for a "I'm sorry," he muttered, just before going across the room to sit on the side of the bed. "I know I shouldn't be here, but it's okay," he added in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. My heart was pounding, but he hesitated. "What's on your mind?" Keeping my eyes on the ground, I've been considering what I stated forcefully earlier, and I'm afraid I fouled things up. You didn't, James. I told you that we would work things out, but it will take. I know he trembled when he said that. But it's difficult. I feel trapped in my own head, and I'm not sure how to get out. I put a hand on his shoulder and gave it a light squeeze, saying, "You're not alone." He looked up, then his eyes met mine, and the two of us worked through this together. My chest tightened at the intensity of his gaze. "You've always supported me. I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered quietly, even when no one else was there. "Don't worry about it." I stated in a firm voice that I wouldn't be leaving for a minute. Nobody of us spoke. The heavy quiet between us seemed James's look was raw, and I wasn't sure how to handle his unspoken feelings. I've never seen someone so vulnerable, and it left me speechless. I just want everything to be all right. At last, his voice broke as he added, "I don't want to lose you. You won't I?" I remarked in a shaky voice. "But James, we must establish boundaries. Isn't something we can allow to rule us?" he said softly, but his face was, "I'm trying, I know you are," I said in a troubled tone. "Gentler now, and that's what counts." The room's tension changed. James didn't want to leave, so he settled into something less oppressive, rather than completely leaving, as I had anticipated, but instead he lingered, looking into my eyes, as if attempting to discover something that he was unable to identify. The air between us felt electric, and each breath was amplified. After a minute, I murmured to James, "Silence but steady. We can't maintain." I am aware that he reiterated that it is not healthy for us to keep going around this. His honesty was almost whispery, but I'm not sure how to let it go. Disarming, and I noticed that I was leaning forward a little, as though being near to each other may somehow close the emotional distance as well. Perhaps I mentioned that you must confront it directly, a scowl of bewilderment flashing across his face. "What do you mean?" I paused, my heart racing as I thought about what I was saying. Occasionally, I spoke slowly. "The only to go past anything, you must stop avoiding it and accept it completely." His eyes met mine, and his brow furrowed as he took in what I had spoken. I gently intervened, suggesting that perhaps you should stop stifling your emotions. Everything up to allow yourself to experience it so that you can let his eyes go at last. Dawning on him, my eyes widened slightly. "It's okay, Aaron," I whispered quietly, putting a hand out to touch his, but it was only for a brief moment, and he didn't move for a while, his eyes fixed on mine, as the room's weight pressed down on us. And then he leaned in, and our lips momentarily touched, only a tentative, faint brush. It ended almost as soon as it started because of the weight of unsaid feelings. James withdrew his expression, leaving the stillness between us thick, a mix of surprise and doubt. "I'm sorry," he stumbled, his voice shaking. I continued. He looked me in the eyes without saying anything for a moment. Damn it. I kind of enjoyed it, brother, so I did it again, with some hesitancy, leaned forward, and we shared another kiss, this one more intense, as though We were both trying to figure out what the lines were. After a while, we came to a halt, and I moved my hand in a specific spot to start anything. Beyond the bounds of incredulity, he met my eyes, and I moved forward without saying a word, and we both went beyond. And I must say that what we did was insane, but it was so wonderful, was incredible, and after we were both done, we lay down and realized James broke the stillness by saying, "What just happened? Wow, I don't know what." To be honest, it's okay. I interrupted him abruptly and said, "It's done now. Can proceed." He gazed at me, his eyes full of inquiries, but he remained silent and stood his "Good night, Aaron," he whispered, moving cautiously as if hesitant to break the delicate calm we had discovered. When the door clicked, I silently said, "Good night," as I watched him leave the room. Closing behind him, I shakily exhaled, my mind a tornado of feelings. The moment had been brief. However, it felt like a big step forward, one that might help us both find clarity. I had no idea what was ahead, but for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. The house seemed hopeful that we could work through it together the following morning. Lighter in some way, James came to breakfast with me, and he seemed more at ease than he had been in days. Plans for the day, the relaxed and easy talk, and it felt like a positive move, so I held on to it. Hope as the hours went by, and it was time for me to part ways with James. Showed me the way to the door. Josh wasn't home yet, but that was a comfort in hiding. "I appreciate you staying, but this was something I had to deal with alone." James smiled softly, but genuinely, saying, "I'm glad I did. It meant a lot. I'll be back shortly, all right? Let's continue our conversation and work it out." He nodded. As I drove away, his look was hopeful. "Yeah, we will." Although the house appeared smaller in the rearview mirror, the burden of all that had transpired continued to weigh on me for days. I knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, I thought we were headed in the right direction, and that was nevertheless, life returned to its normal rhythm at my flat. But the recollection of that night stayed with me, and I found myself wondering how James was more often than I wanted to admit. A few weeks later, he texted me to ask if he had managed to get the clarity he needed. "I wanted to thank you once again, since now that things are clearer, I'm doing okay." Pondered the message for a while before responding, "I'm glad you took it one. Step at a time, all right. I'm always available if you need me." His answer was straightforward. It wasn't precisely closure, but it was a step in the right direction, and I'll be all right. That was sufficient for the time being, but I'm still not really sure how I feel about it. I want to know what other people think. Is what we did and what I did acceptable? Should I feel bad? I would greatly appreciate it if you could let me know in the comments.